In the late 1970s, there were few sights in baseball more uncomfortable than J.R. Richard standing on a mound in Houston. 6'8", fastball near 100, a slider that came in like bad news. He struck out 303 batters in 1978, then 313 more in 1979. By 1980, he was an all-star starter, an ERA champion, and one of the few pitchers feared by men who feared almost nobody. This wasn't potential anymore. This was greatness in progress. And then, in the middle of what should have been his prime, the story changed in a way baseball didn't fully understand at the time. J.R. Richard didn't fade away. Something happened, and the question still lingers: how much history did we almost see? On July 30, 1980, J.R. Richard was in the outfield at the Astrodome, warming up before a Houston Astros game. This was not an old pitcher trying to hang on. This was not a man at the end of a slow decline. This was one of the most overpowering pitchers in baseball, a 6'8" right-hander with a fastball that made good hitters look late, a slider that came in harder than some pitchers' fastballs, and a season that still looked like it might become one of the best of his career. Then he collapsed. A stroke had hit him before a game, in uniform, in the same ballpark where he had spent years turning raw power into something close to dominance. The cause would be traced to dangerous blockages in his arteries. Later examinations showed he had been dealing with extensive arterial thoracic outlet syndrome, a condition where, while pitching, his clavicle and first rib could pinch the subclavian artery. It helped explain the strange symptoms he had been describing: the dead arm, the numb fingers, the trouble seeing signs, the heaviness that arrived after he had already started pitching. But by the time the explanation became clear, the career had already changed forever. J.R. Richard never pitched in another major league game. That is the part many people remember, if they remember him at all: the collapse, the stroke, the career cut short. But that is not where the story really begins. Because the hard part, looking back, is not just that J.R. Richard's career ended suddenly. It is that it ended while he was still one of the best pitchers in the world. In the first half of 1980, Richard was not slipping. He was terrifying. He opened the season with 5 straight wins. He struck out 48 batters early, with games of 12 and 13 strikeouts. At one point, he threw 3 straight complete game shutouts, 2 against the Giants, 1 against the Cubs. By the All-Star break, he was 10-4 with a 1.96 ERA and 115 strikeouts. He was chosen to start the All-Star game for the National League. That was the version of J.R. Richard, standing on the edge of history in 1980. Not a memory, not a cautionary tale, a present tense force. And there was something else happening in Houston that year. Nolan Ryan had arrived as a free agent, giving the Astros 2 towering power arms at the front of the conversation. Ryan was already a legend, already a national name, already the pitcher people associated with impossible velocity and strikeout records. But inside the National League, hitters knew Richard belonged in that conversation too. Dale Murphy later said that if you played in the late 1970s or early 1980s, the toughest pitcher to get a hit off was probably J.R. Richard. Johnny Bench, one of the greatest catchers and hitters of his era, also named Richard as the toughest pitcher he ever faced. Those kinds of comments matter because they do not come from myth. They come from the batter's box. They come from men who had to stand in against him, with no camera angle to soften what the pitch looked like. Richard's fastball was not just fast. It came from height, extension, and violence. His slider was not just a breaking ball. It was a hard, late-moving pitch that could make the at-bat feel unfair. He could be wild, and that was part of the fear. A hitter could not relax. There was too much velocity, too much movement, too little comfort. The strange thing is that baseball had seen the warning signs of his greatness almost from the beginning. On September 5, 1971,
Richard made his major league debut for the Houston Astros in the second game of a doubleheader against the San Francisco Giants. He was 21 years old.
In his first major league start, he struck out 15 batters. That tied Carl Spooner's major league record for strikeouts in a first start. And this was not done against anonymous hitters in an empty moment. Richard struck out Willie Mays 3 times. He struck out Dick Dietz 3 times. The Astros won 5-3, and a young pitcher from Louisiana had announced himself with one of the loudest debuts a pitcher could make. A debut like that usually becomes the first sentence of a legend, but Richard's story never moved in a straight line. The Astros had drafted him 2nd overall in 1969, behind Jeff Burroughs. He had come out of Lincoln High School in Ruston, Louisiana, where he was not just a baseball prospect, but also a major basketball talent. He reportedly turned down more than 200 basketball scholarship offers to sign with Houston. By the time he was a high school senior, he stood 6'8" and weighed around 220 pounds. He was the kind of athlete who changed the feel of a field just by walking onto it. In high school, he was dominant to a degree that almost sounds unreal. He did not allow a run for an entire season. In one game, he hit 4 consecutive home runs while pitching his team to a 48-0 win. He never lost a game he started in high school. His baseball idol was Bob Gibson. That detail feels right. Gibson had made intimidation into an art form. Richard would become a different kind of presence, but he carried some of that same feeling. The idea that an at-bat could become a test of courage before it became a test of skill. Still, professional baseball asked something different of him. In the minors, the arm was obvious. The command was not. At Covington, in rookie ball, he struck out 71 batters in 56 innings, but walked 52. At Cocoa, he threw a no-hitter and posted a 2.39 ERA, but the larger pattern remained. Hitters could barely square him up, yet he was still learning how to control the gift. At Oklahoma City in AAA, he struck out 202 batters in 173 innings. The stuff kept saying he belonged. The walks kept complicating the answer. From 1971 through 1974, Richard moved between Houston and the minors. He had flashes, good outings, rough ones, relief appearances, starts, demotions, and returns. He was not yet the permanent force he would become. Richard later told reporters that he believed racism played a role in keeping him from becoming a regular with the big club sooner. That belongs in the story because it was part of how he understood his own career. It also fits the larger world he came through. A black power pitcher in an era when baseball had changed, but had not become simple. Still, the baseball explanation at the time was often his wildness. He threw hard enough to overwhelm almost anyone, but he also walked too many hitters. The Astros had to decide whether they were looking at a future ace or a pitcher whose talent might always outrun his control. Then the opening came. Before the 1975 season, Houston's rotation changed dramatically. Claude Osteen was traded to the Cardinals. Don Wilson, the Astros' ace and one of the great pitchers in franchise history, died from carbon monoxide poisoning in January at only 29 years old. Richard entered 1975 as a regular member of the starting rotation. He was not polished. He still walked hitters. He led the National League in walks and wild pitches that year. But he also led the Astros with 176 strikeouts, and he finished 12-10 for a team that went 64-97. That matters. A pitcher's record can look ordinary until you remember the team around him. On a last-place club, Richard was one of the few things that pointed forward. Then came 1976. At 26, J.R. Richard became the pitcher Houston had been waiting for. He took over as the Astros' opening day starter. By the end of the season, he had thrown 291 innings. He won 20 games. He struck out 214 batters. He finished with a 2.75 ERA, 14 complete games, and 3 shutouts.
He became only the second pitcher in Astros history to win 20 games in a season after Larry Dierker. He also became part of the group later known as the Black Aces, African-American pitchers who won at least 20 major league games in a season. There is a certain kind of arrival in baseball that does not need much decoration. A 20-win season in the 1970s meant something. A 20-win season in the 1970s meant something.
It meant the manager trusted you deep into games. It meant you carried losses and fatigue and bad innings and still took the ball again. It meant your name was not just on the roster, it was on the marquee. Richard was still imperfect. He led the league in walks. He made errors in the field. His game could be loud in more than one direction. But now the strikeouts and the innings were no longer just signs of potential. They were production. And from 1976 through 1979, Richard gave Houston one of the greatest pitching stretches the franchise had ever seen. In 1977, he went 18-12 with a 2.97 ERA and 214 strikeouts. He threw 13 complete games. He led the Astros in wins, starts, complete games, innings, walks, and strikeouts. In 1978, the strikeout totals jumped from impressive to historic. Richard struck out 303 batters. At the time, he became only the 10th pitcher, the third National Leaguer, and the first National League right-hander to strike out more than 300 batters in a single season. He broke Don Wilson's Astros record. He broke Tom Seaver's National League record for strikeouts by a right-hander. He reached 300 by striking out Roland Office of the Braves late in September. He led the National League in strikeouts. He led it in strikeouts per 9 innings. He led it in fewest hits allowed per 9 innings. He also led in walks and wild pitches, which tells you the full picture. Overpowering, uncomfortable, not always tidy, never easy. The numbers show dominance. The shape of the numbers shows menace. Hitters batted .196 against him overall in 1978. At home, they hit 1.56. That is not a pitcher merely getting outs. That is a pitcher shrinking the field. Then in 1979, Richard became more than a strikeout artist. He became the league's ERA champion. He finished 18-13 with a 2.71 ERA. He struck out 313 batters, breaking his own club record. He joined Nolan Ryan and Sandy Koufax as the only modern pitchers to strike out more than 300 batters in consecutive seasons. He led the National League in ERA, strikeouts, hits allowed per 9 innings, and strikeouts per 9 innings. He finished third in the Cy Young voting, behind Bruce Sutter and his own teammate Joe Niekro. That detail says something about the time. Relief pitching was being valued in new ways. Win totals still carried enormous weight. Niekro won 21 games for Houston that year. Richard won 18. But if you were asking who made hitters the least comfortable, Richard's name sat near the top of the sport. His 313 strikeouts remained the Astros' single-season franchise record until Gerrit Cole passed it in 2019. 40 years. That is how long the mark stood. For fans who remember the Astrodome, the rainbow uniforms, the artificial turf, the low-scoring tension of late 1970s baseball, Richard was not a footnote. He was an event. A big right-hander on a mound in Houston, throwing the kind of baseball that made every radar gun number feel like a rumor, and every at-bat feel like survival. By the end of 1979, he had signed a 4-year contract with the Astros. He was entering his age 30 season. He had just led the league in ERA and strikeouts. Ryan was coming to town. Houston had reason to believe the next few years could be special. And for a while, in 1980, they were. Richard was named National League Pitcher of the Month for April. He opened the season like a man who had found an even higher gear. On July 3, he broke Larry Dierker's Astros career strikeout record in a 5-3 win over the Braves. It was his final major league victory.
That is one of those facts that does not announce itself at the time. Nobody watching that game could know they had just seen the last win of J.R. Richards' career. Baseball is full of those hidden endings. A final hit that looks like any other single. A last start that feels like a bad day. A last victory that disappears inside the standings until history circles it in red. After the All-Star break, the story began to shift. Richard had been dealing with back and shoulder issues, and in the All-Star game on July 8, he pitched only 2 innings. He began talking about a dead arm. He cited discomfort in his shoulder and forearm. The reaction around him was not simply concern. Some in the media interpreted the complaints as whining or malingering.
Others suggested ego, pressure, or jealousy over Nolan Ryan's contract. The source material makes clear that these theories existed at the time. And looking back, they give the story a painful edge, because the physical problem was real. On July 14th, against the Atlanta Braves, Richard was pitching well. He struck out the side in the second inning. But something was wrong. He had trouble seeing catcher Alan Ashby's signs. He had difficulty moving his arm. In the fourth inning, after throwing a fastball, he felt his right arm go dead. His fingers were numb. He could not grasp a baseball. The Astros put him on the 21-day disabled list. 9 days later, he checked into Methodist Hospital in Houston for tests. An angiogram showed an obstruction in the distal subclavian and axillary arteries of his right arm. The blood pressure in his left arm was normal, but nearly absent in his right arm because of the obstruction. Then, on July 25, doctors studied the arteries in his neck and concluded that everything was normal and that no surgical treatment was needed. 5 days later, Richard suffered the stroke. That is the part that still feels hard to sit with. Not because it can be turned into simple blame from a distance. Medicine is complicated. Diagnosis is complicated. The source does not give us every conversation, every exam, every private judgment. But the public facts are enough to create the ache. He said something was wrong. His body was sending signals, and the full explanation came too late. On the day of the stroke, Richard had gone to see a chiropractor who rotated his neck in an attempt to improve blood flow in his upper torso region. Later that day, during warm-ups, Richard experienced a headache and weakness through his body. Then came vision problems and paralysis on the left side. A massive blockage in his right carotid artery required emergency surgery that night. A neurologist found weakness in his extremities and on the left side of his face, along with blurred vision in his left eye. A CAT scan later showed he had experienced 3 separate strokes from different obstructions in his arterial system. The arteries in his right arm were still obstructed. Later examinations showed the extensive arterial thoracic outlet syndrome. The explanation was cruelly logical. While pitching, the motion and pressure could cause his clavicle and first rib to pinch the subclavian artery. He could feel normal for the first few innings, then the arm would begin to ache, grow heavy, and fail him. His wife at the time, Carolyn, said, "It took death, or nearly death, to get an apology. They should have believed him." That quote carries a lot of weight because it does not need embellishment. Richard missed the rest of the season. The Astros kept playing. Baseball kept moving. The standings did not pause. The box scores continued. That is one of the cold truths of sports. A player's life can split in two, and the schedule still says tomorrow's game starts at 7:35. But for Richard, the mound was no longer the same place. In 1981, he tried to come back. The stroke had left his left side partially paralyzed, and he entered a rehabilitation program with the hope of returning. He trained with the Astros and with the Texas Southern University team. Near the end of the season, he participated in pitching and batting practice. He pitched in simulated games. On September 1, 1981, he was placed on Houston's 40-man active roster. But Astros manager Bill Verdon did not think he was ready to pitch. Richard did not appear in a game.
In 1982, he pitched in one spring training game and then went to extended spring training in Sarasota. There, he posted a 3.38 ERA in 7 starts. He later joined Daytona Beach in the Florida State League and had a 2.79 ERA in 6 starts, with 3 wins and 2 complete games. Those numbers suggest that something was still there, but the climb from flashes in the minors back to being J.R. Richard in the National League was enormous. At AAA Tucson, he struggled with control and gave up runs. His longest outing of more than 5 innings came in the final game of the season. He rejoined the Astros extended roster, but he did not pitch in a major league game. In 1983, he began complaining of pain in his left calf.
The synthetic graft inserted during his 1980 surgery had closed off, and he needed a surgical bypass in his left leg. Houston granted him free agency in November 1983, re-signed him in February 1984, and released him on April 27, 1984. That was the official end. His final major league record was 107 wins and 71 losses, a 3.15 ERA, and 1,493 strikeouts in 1,606 innings. Those are excellent numbers, but they are not the numbers he was on pace to leave behind. That is where the what-if lives. Not in fantasy, not in exaggeration, in the plain arithmetic of a career interrupted at the top. Richard had already won 107 games by age 30. He had already produced 2 300-strikeout seasons. He had already led the National League in ERA. He had already earned the respect of the best hitters in the game. He had already become the kind of pitcher fans came to the park to see and opponents hoped to avoid. Then, the record stops. Baseball history is often built for players with long endings, the legends who age in public, the veterans who chase milestones, the stars who get October moments, farewell tours, anniversary clips, documentary packages, and Hall of Fame arguments that last for decades. Richard did not get that kind of ending. He played his entire major league career with Houston from 1971 to 1980. The Astros of that era were not the national brand they would become later. His peak came before the modern highlight machine, before sports cable could preserve every dominant start in endless rotation, before younger fans could easily see what older fans meant when they said, "You had to watch him." And after baseball, his life became harder than most fans knew. Richard returned to Louisiana and invested in business ventures. He lost more than $300,000 in an oil business scam. A divorce settlement with his ex-wife Carolyn cost him $669,000. He married and divorced again. He lost his suburban Houston home and most of his money. In 1989, he was drafted into the Senior Professional Baseball Association and played for the Orlando Juice, but he was cut in preseason. By the winter of 1994, J.R. Richard was homeless in Houston, living under a highway overpass. For anyone who remembers the pitcher in his prime, that detail lands heavily. Not because it should replace the baseball story, but because it shows how far a life can travel from what the public thinks it knows. A fan may remember the fastball, a box score may remember the strikeouts, but a man has to keep living after the cheering stops. By 1995, Richard was eligible for his Major League Baseball pension. That same year, he played in an Old Timers Day game with the Astros. He also found help through Now Testament Church and Reverend Floyd Lewis after nights spent near Highway 59 at Beechnut Road in Houston. Richard later became a Christian minister. He worked at an asphalt company. He returned to the church. He became involved in the Houston community and helped establish baseball programs for children. That part of the story should not be treated as a neat ending that erases everything before it. Life is rarely that clean. But it does matter that Richard was not frozen forever in the worst chapter people heard about him.
he rebuilt. He was honored, too. A low-budget 2005 movie, Resurrection, the J.R. Richards story, depicted his baseball career and life after baseball. In 2018, the Negro League's Baseball Museum honored him as a member of its Hall of Game. In 2019, he was inducted into the Baseball Reliquary's Shrine of the Eternals. That same year, the Houston Astros inducted him into their Hall of Fame. For a franchise that had grown, changed leagues, changed uniforms, changed eras, and eventually become a national baseball power, Richard remained part of its deeper memory. Before the modern Astros, before the later October identity, before the franchise became something different, there was J.R. Richard on the mound in the Astrodome, making hitters feel like the game had sped up. He died on August 4, 2021, at a Houston hospital. He was 71. His family said he had been experiencing complications from COVID-19. When a player like Richard dies, the record book tells one version of the story: 107 wins, 3.15 ERA, 1,493 strikeouts, 1 All-Star selection, 1 ERA title, 2 National League strikeout titles. Those facts are true. They are important.
But they do not fully explain why his name still carries weight among people who saw him, or among baseball historians who understand what his peak meant. Because J.R. Richards' story is not about a pitcher who failed to become great. He became great. The question is how much greater he might have become if his body had allowed the story to continue. That is the ache at the center of it. Not every unfinished career is the same. Some players flash for a month. Some are built up by hype and never quite match it. Some burn brightly because the league has not adjusted yet. Richard was different. He had already adjusted. He had already endured the control problems, the minor league shuttling, the doubts, the long innings, the walks, the pressure of becoming an ace. He had already turned frightening tools into elite production. By 1979 and early 1980, he was not a projection. He was proof. Then the proof was cut short. For fans who came of age in the 1970s, he belongs to a particular kind of baseball memory. The player whose card you knew, whose stat line made you pause, whose name sounded bigger than the box score, whose career made adults say, if only. For younger fans, he is a reminder that the past is full of players who were not preserved by constant video, but who were absolutely real to the men who had to face them. That is why the testimony of Bench and Murphy matters. That is why the 313 strikeouts matter. That is why the 1980 All-Star start matters. That is why the Astros Hall of Fame induction matters. They all point to the same truth. J.R. Richard was not merely a sad story. He was one of the most intimidating pitchers of his era, and for a brief stretch, one of the best pitchers alive. Baseball can be generous to accumulation. It loves round numbers, long careers, clean endings, and plaques that make everything feel settled. But sometimes greatness arrives in a shorter window. Sometimes it is 5 seasons of dominance. Sometimes it is 2 straight years with 300 strikeouts. Sometimes it is a 6'8" right-hander in Houston, throwing so hard that future Hall of Famers remembered the feeling decades later.
And sometimes, the meaning of a career is not found in how long it lasted, but in how impossible the game looked while it was happening. J.R. Richard deserves to be remembered because he stood that close to the larger legend, close enough that you can still see the outline. His career says something uncomfortable and honest about baseball. Talent can be enormous, timing can be cruel, and even the strongest arm in the league is still attached to a human life. For a few years, J.R. Richard made the mound feel like the highest place in the ballpark. And then, before the story was finished, baseball had to learn what it had almost witnessed.